next speaker, Christiane is Associate Professor and Associate Dean at the New School's School of Media Studies and Adjunct Curator of New Media Arts at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Her recent books are A Companion to Digital Art, Context Providers, Conditions of Meaning in Media Arts, and New Media in the White Cube and Beyond. At the Whitney Museum, she curated exhibitions including Corey Archangel Pro Tools in 2011 and Profiling in 2007, and is responsible for Artport, the Whitney Museum's portal to internet art. Christiane will be speaking about the evolution of software-based art, a history of art production and curatorial practice. Please join me in welcoming Christiane Paul.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's really exciting to be here. I think it's a terrific lineup. One caveat, as you may have guessed, I will not be able to talk about the whole history of art production and curatorial practice in 20 minutes, so all I can do in relation to software-based art is ultimately throw a spotlight on certain instances and contextualize them here. So when we're talking about software-based art, this can intersect with various forms or be the basis of such, ranging from networked installation, net art, software art, which is understood as art coded, hand-coded very often by the artist, virtual mixed and augmented reality or locative media art that uses the real world as a canvas for the creation of an artwork. And in the following, I will focus mostly on software art and net art to talk about various instances and bring up both curatorial and preservation challenges as they intersect. When we're talking about the history of software-based art, we have to talk about the history of instruction-based art as it intersects with computation, and we have to go back centuries. So what you're looking at right now is basically an example of generative tiling, rule-based tiling, but you can go back to Islamic tiles to look at rule-based, instruction-based, proto-computational forms of images. Also very important in this context is the intersection with weaving. You may all know about the Jacquard loom, which Joseph-Marie Jacquard premiered in 1801, and that was used for the pattern creation in weaving through punch cards. What you're looking at here is one of the gigantic punch card operated looms in Norway, but this background is also very important to the history of software art and computational art. Lev Manovich in particular has talked about avant-garde as software and pointed to the fact that during the years 1915 to 1928, avant-garde artists invented a whole new set of visual and spatial languages. So you might trace certain elements of software back to previous experimentations. You can see an element of collage in cut and paste operations. And you can see a connection between Lisitsky's movable frames and dynamic windows or pull-down menus and tables. So Manovich actually argues that the old media avant-garde of the 20s came up with new forms of seeing the world, while the new avant-garde is no longer concerned with seeing or representing the world as is in new ways, but with seeing and representing previously accumulated media in new ways, which means that new media is always meta-media, and when we're looking at software-based art, we're also looking at a form of meta-media. So since the 1940s, we have been looking at a lot of technological and theoretical developments that really have informed software-based art, among them the rise of digital computing and radar, cybernetics as formalized in 1948 by Norbert Wiener, looking at command and control and communication in the animal and the machine. And in the late 60s, we also saw the creation of ARPANET and ultimately the roots of the internet. In the 50s and 60s, there really was a rise of participatory and technological art that may be non-technological, but I think the ideas all intersect. So at Bell Labs, you had programmers such as Ben Lepowski, John Whitney Sr., and Max Matthews in the field of computer music, working away. Max MSP was also named after Max Matthews, and he created the singing voice for Hell in 2001. And then artists such as Lillian Schwartz and Stan Vanderbeek working in this environment. John Cage, Alan Kaprow, and Fluxus in general all worked with instruction-based code and translated it into various kinds of actions. And you can also trace the influence of instructions in European composers' work. And then you saw a rise of art that used kineticism, cybernetics, and computational principles, even if that art wasn't necessarily computational. But at the time, we're looking at groups such as Zero, which had a big exhibition here at the Guggenheim, Grave, and very important new tendencies in the former Yugoslavia, which was a series of exhibitions that was really instrumental to the rise of computer-based arts from the 60s to the 70s. When we're looking at the exhibition history from the 1950s to the 70s, you see a lot of seminal shows in that area. In the mid-60s already, there were 2 exhibitions at the Stuttgart University Art Gallery, which showed Georg Nees and Frida Nake, and the Howard Weiss Art Gallery in New York, featuring Michael Noll and Bela Julesh, that particularly focused on code art that took the form of prints at the time. And of course, we had the seminal exhibitions of EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, or Cybernetic Serendipity at the ICA in London. So here just one example, one of the works, Robert Rauschenberg's Open Score, that was part of the EAT exhibition. So here, sensor-equipped tennis rackets that would ultimately also shoot out the lights in the space. And then Edward Inatovich, SAM, sound-activated mobile, which you see on the lower right, which reacts to people's voices in the space and moves its head accordingly. And up on the top left, originally commissioned by Philips Inatovich Sensor, which is known as the actually first computer-controlled robotic type of artwork. So the Sensor was a lot more evolved than SAM and actually responded both to people's sounds and movements in the space, dismantled in 1974. The exhibition history from the 1970s onwards shows a real change in that, apart from a few exhibitions at Tate and others, you see that computer-based art, software art moves into more specialized venues. We see the Ars Electronica Festival coming about, ZKM in Germany being formed. So what you see here is actually a split, and there is a lot more to say about that. And then again, around the 2000s, a rise again in exhibitions at SF MoMA, the Whitney Museum, and others, responding to, again, increased practice in that field. So when we're talking about software-based art, its curation and its preservation, we're talking about certain characteristics that have a deep influence on many, many steps along the way. The fact that this software is time-based, real-time, algorithmic, it can be generative, it's often automated and interactive, and all of that influences our decisions in curation and also in preservation. Matthew Fuller and Beatrice Fasi, in their article Computational Aesthetics, have identified certain features and characteristics that, to varying degrees, articulate the reality of computation, and some of these characteristics have already popped up in Joanna's introduction. Again, they have an influence on how we show and preserve that art. Discreteness, speeds, scale, memory, logical equivalence, all of those are aspects we need to talk about here. One thing that is very important to me in terms of the aesthetics of software art is the relationship between the back end and the front end. So when we're talking about software art, we're talking about art based on code as formal instructions. This can range from generative art to code poetry. The art historical precedents, again, would be Fluxus, Dada, works by John Cage or Solowit. And Florian Kramer, in his article Concepts, Notations, Software Art, has pointed out that there are two opposite approaches to software art. One more focused on a cultural, politically coded construct, the other one more on the formal poetics and aesthetics of software code and the individual subjectivity that is expressed here. But both as a curator and a conservator, you really have to pay attention to those intents and how you contextualize and frame them. So Florian Kramer in particular has talked about the aesthetics of perception versus the poetics of construction on the back end, and I will return to that at the end of my talk because I think these are very important aspects. So again, Solowit, definitely one of the predecessors of software-based art in these instructions. So here you see wall drawing number 85. When we commissioned Casey Rhea's software structures in 2004 for the Whitney Museum's art site, we actually asked Levitt for permission to have Casey, who together with Ben Fry created processing, encode some of his works. So here's an image of Lewitt's work. Here is Casey's implementation of it in processing, and what you see, of course, is a radical difference in the line, in the color, and the look and feel of that work. A few lines from the code. Another work that Casey also implemented, Lewitt's wall drawing number 358. So here you see the processing version, and he also created an animated version, and yet another work he did was an interactive version of one of Lewitt's wall drawings. So in the 60s and 70s, you saw a lot of the work by the so-called algorists, Manfred Mohr, Roman Verosco, Frida Nake, and Vera Molnar, Chuck Suri, Harold Cohen. So people who actually only right now receive the attention for their work and lifetime achievement awards, but they were incredibly influential in pushing the medium of software-based art forward. So here an example of Nake's Matrizenmultiplikation, and what you see in this short trailer about comp art is really the process of creating that work. So these were often works written in machine language and then printed out again through punch cards and big machinery working on the back end. But what you then see on the front end are these pieces of printed software art. I want to be very clear about the categories I'm creating here. They are not categories I would ever use as a curator, nor do I think that they are art historically relevant in any way. I created them specifically for this symposium because they are relevant for thinking through curation and preservation. So what you see in these works by Vera Molnar or Manfred Mohr, here are his variations on the hypercube, are works that ultimately appear on paper. And the curatorial challenge here is contextualizing a print hanging on the wall, not as a drawing, but as a piece of software art. And for preservation, it's of course not all about preserving this piece of paper that is hanging on the wall, but also preserving the code. And I think we're at a very different stage in time now. Manfred Mohr once told me that someone was actually throwing tomatoes at him when they found out that his work was created by computers, completely heretic, and he decided to actually not talk about that anymore and just let it go, exhibit the prints, and at the next exhibition someone came up to him and said, "You should really work with computers. I see connections here, and he just thanked the person for it. So what also happened early on were algorithmic drawing machines. Since these are works that are printed out by machines, the machines were often displayed too. So here you have one of Roman Verosco's pen plotter drawings in action, Harold Cohen's Aaron, one of the first pieces of artificial intelligence software ongoing since the 1970s. So Aaron as a program that actually draws its own intelligence, here very representational. Aaron has become much more abstract over the years. And interestingly, the work and software were overtaken by the drawing mechanisms. So way back when, in the 70s and 80s, people actually got more obsessed with the drawing device, the so-called turtle, than Aaron as a piece of software. So the hardware moved to the foreground. And Eugleni's project, Victor as a drawing machine, of course, has to be seen in that context too. And here the emphasis also is really on not creating a perfect drawing, but there is something non-perfect hand-drawn about it. But again, Victor also stands in that tradition of drawing machines. And the challenge here, both from a curatorial and preservation perspective, is of course about negotiating materialities. There's the code, there's the drawing created by that machine, there's the drawing device. How important is that to the curatorial and preservation process? So these kind of challenges often intersect, and there's of course a lot more to say about the work, but we'll get to the case studies later. Then you have screen-based or projected software art. This is newer manifestation of Manfred Moore's work, Space Color. So here you have some of the similar ideas he explored early on in the 60s and 70s in a screen-based space. And also John F. Simon Jr.'s color panel version 1.0, very famous example, and this was part of the Seeing Double exhibition here at the Guggenheim, organized by John Ippolito, Carol Stringari, and Caitlin Jones at the time. The reason I bring this up is because it posed some very interesting, to me, material challenges. So this was an example of migration, and what you see on the left and in the middle is the work on a PowerBook 280C laptop, and you see below the screen kind of exposed hardware. And in the original PowerBook version of it, this was really just the computer stripped of its casing and the guts exposed. On the G3, you see on the right, I got very confused first looking at it, thinking, what is this? The G3 is actually, the guts are put together in a very different way, and John decided to actually just glue on the materials on the screen. So this is not the computer taken out of its casing anymore. And I thought that was just a horrible choice, and I don't know, some of you in the audience may have had these discussions with him, and it was very interesting to talk this through with him, why he decided to basically add this decorative element to preserve the previous version. And after talking to him, I understood those decisions a lot better. Also in this category of screen-based works, although very different, would be John Gerard's South Arm. So here you have a simulation, a work that looks very photographic, but ultimately presents a 360-degree view and fly-through of a real site that has been created through extensive documentation. And as Joanna said, as many of John Gerard's projects have, there is a time-based component in that every 156 days a truck arrives to this farm. And there are other works where you see a smile over the course of a year, or works that unfold over much, much longer periods of time. Another case study presented here, which again raises different types of challenges. It's the work by Feng Mengbo. I just want to concentrate on one of them. So here you have basically historical events and narratives encoded as a kind of Nintendo game. And you should experience this basically very embodied, following this gigantic scroll and interacting with it. So the scale of it is absolutely crucial, and that of course brings up questions related to resolution, how does that affect scale? But the embodiment of the interactor and visitor to that piece is really key here, both from a curatorial perspective and from the preservation one. We have early on in the history of software-based art experiments with this type of embodied interaction with the image. Myron Kruger famously in his works from metaplay to video plays experimented with having the body of the visitor interact with what is happening on the screen, and this is a clear predecessor to works such as Camille Oderbach's Untitled 5, which is basically a embodied kind of drawing environment where you drive the evolution of that drawing through your body and through your movements. So the curatorial challenges here again are negotiating materialities, contextualizing real-time events, and also scale of the interaction. And I think there's a lot of intersection between the curatorial and preservation challenges here that have to be considered. If I could get sound for just a little bit at a low level. Another challenge that is presented by software art are external components. So what you are looking at here is Ian Chang's Baby Feet Bali, a work in the collection of the Whitney Museum. The image here should actually be vertical, although this is how you find it on Vimeo and other platforms. So this is a live simulation created in the Unity 3D game engine, and the official credit line is Artificial Intelligence Services. What this project uses is a dialogue between bots on the net to drive the visuals. So it is driven by bots. All of these works, of course, create the question, well, what do we do if those external services vanish at some point? So if you could cut the sound again, that would be great. Same goes for John Gerard's Watchful Portrait, Caroline, a work in which this portrait actually opens and closes its eyes, or Caroline opens and closes her eyes, depending on sun and moon phases, also connected to external sources. And Zebra and Versteeg's Untitled Film 2, where you have birth and death announcements coming in. So what do we do with that? Do we create archives and databases of it? Do we switch to the next available service? All of these are questions to be asked. It is interesting to think about the fact that when these works get collected, very often artists sell archives of specific time frames. So that is the collector model. So the contextualization of external data and the preservation of external data are main challenges here, and I want to end by briefly flipping through some categories of net art and coming back to one of the earlier points I made about the back end and front end of software art. So many artists writing software art or software-based art also understand the writing of their code as a form of creative writing. So the code is as important to them as the front end that you see or that you interact with. This admittedly varies highly. Some artists would say nobody needs to see my code or know what it's doing, and others would say it's absolutely substantial to what they have done. And we also philosophically have to think through that when we preserve works. In 2002, I curated an exhibition called Code Doc that precisely tried to look at that, the relationship between the back end and the front end. And I gave a dozen artists an assignment: connect 3 points in space in a main that would be only 12K, so very very hard to do. And of course, they could interpret this in very different ways. So here you're looking at Martin Wattenberg's code, which is almost, it's written like poetry, and the back end is very important to him. The code in black is what draws the picture, actually, and on the front end, this is what you see and what you interact with. This moire patterns created through the movement of your server, of your cursor. Brad Paley had difficulties figuring out how he should handle that assignment or the code space, so he decided to make the back end, the front end, and collapse the two. So the front end was basically the code itself with a white insertion point tracing the code in the order it was written, the amber fixation point tracing word by word as you would read it, and the green execution point showing a sample of how the computer would read that code. So here you see the work and the different forms of reading of it. Since the code was made public, artists started remixing it. So here you have him pointing his code at Martin Wattenberg countering with creating another way of looking at his code. And I'll end by just one other example, the code only, John Klima's piece in which the code tells a story. What you would see on the front end is basically Super Mario chasing the princess up a ladder towards the pail. And if you read the code, it's the story show, if your attitude chauvinist, then if fetch pale Jack Jill, then go uphill Jack Jill. If fell down Jack, but broke crown Jack, then tumbling after Jill Jack, or the opposite thereof. So what needs to be preserved here absolutely is, of course, that story and how that story is told as a mini expert system. So again, challenges curatorially and from a preservation perspective is negotiating that back end versus the front end. Thank you very much. We have time for one question, I think.
That was great, thank you. Have you ever, as a curator, made the decision to exhibit the back end when it was originally not planned to be shown? For example, you showed those printed software-based pieces where the print is the actual outcome, and like, have you ever done like an educational show where you show the audience how these pieces were created?
Well, I mean, apart from CodeDoc, no, I have not. I mean, this is, of course, all online, and you access the work in that order. And actually, I exhibited the back end first. So what you get if you go to artport.whitney.org and take a look at CodeDoc is the code first, and then you enter the piece. But I have never done that in physical space, and I think you really have to discuss this and create this together with artists, because it becomes an educational show, and many artists would be strongly opposed to that, I think. Others might be really excited about doing an exhibition like it. So I think it has to be very carefully framed. The CodeDoc works have never been exhibited in physical space at the Whitney, but some of them were at MoMA in Design and the Elastic Mind, where Brad Paley's work was also exhibited in a very different way with laser pointers reading lines.